Okay, hello everyone. My name is Shakayla Alvarenga. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mob Museum. Thank you for being here tonight. It is truly wonderful to see so many of you here. So last year, the Mob Museum conducted a 3-part program series dedicated to police reform, and the series addressed the nationwide calls to reshape American policing. So as most of you know, the 81st session of the Nevada Legislator, it began on February 1st. The Assembly and Senate adjourned on May 31st. And tonight we'll discuss which police reform bills passed, which did not, and how these legislative measures will shape the future of policing here in our state. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists for the evening. Aaron Ford is the Nevada Attorney General. Rick McCann is the Chief Legislative Lobbyist for the Nevada Association of Public Safety Officers. Leslie Turner is an organizer for the organization Mass Liberation Project. And Senator Dallas Harris represents District 11, joining us via video conference. So many politicians vowed to push for police reforms in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And it's important to note that a special session addressing police reform in Nevada was actually held in August, and most notably, lawmakers banned chokeholds during this session. So what we're going to do here is just start with what passed. So Senate Bill 50, it was a direct response to the killing of Breonna Taylor last year. So the bill passed the Assembly and the Senate unanimously, and it has also been signed by the governor. If you don't know her story, Taylor was 26 years old when she was killed by Louisville Metro police officers attempting to serve a search warrant at her apartment last March. Taylor was shot while she was asleep in bed. Attorney General Aaron Ford proposed a limit on no-knock warrants. Mr. Ford, can you please explain what no-knock warrants are and why you decided to draft this bill?
Well, first off, thank you, Shakayla, for inviting me back into the Mob Museum. Thank you so much for putting this event on. You've been at the forefront of conversations around this issue, and I really appreciate you taking up the conversation, and thank you all for being here today to participate. Delighted to be here with the panelists today. You're going to have, I think, a great conversation and some views on things that I think are worthy of the conversation. To your question, though, about Senate Bill 50, you're right. It's a direct response in the immediate aftermath of Breonna Taylor to try to address something here in Nevada that we want to ensure wouldn't occur, or if it does occur, it occurs in the most minimum opportunities possible. Now, this idea didn't come out of the blue. Let's be clear. In the immediate aftermath of the George Floyd killing, my office put on a forum. It was called the Justice and Injustice Forum, where we held 6 panels that were comprised of various groups, community groups, religious groups, law enforcement groups, legislators, other politicians, where we were looking for not just conversation, but for actual concrete examples of things that we could pass, that we could implement, whether it be policy or law, that would effectuate real positive change in the area of policing, things that would improve the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that we serve. I say we because I now have a badge. And as an African-American man wearing a badge, I think there's a unique intersection that I was able to bring to the conversation. And on this specific issue of no-knock warrants, I wanted to ensure that we, again, in our state here, were able to limit it. Now, no-knock warrants are the types, there are 2 types. There's one type where you see on television where they'll knock on the door and they'll say, "Police," and expect you to come and open the door, and they'll execute a warrant or they'll execute a search. But there's another type where you've also seen where they don't knock on the door, where they just knock the door down. And you can imagine if you're the one on the receiving end of your door being knocked down, not knowing who's coming in, if you're a gun owner, you may shoot at who's coming through that door. And it will make perfect sense that you would do so. But these no-knock warrants we have seen over the course of time have led to deaths. And if not deaths, absolute maiming of individuals, both on the civilian side and on the law enforcement side. And so what we wanted to do was, again, recognizing that it's a problem that has led to deaths and maiming, was to limit the opportunity for that to take place here. I'll say, as we progress through the conversation, that one of the caveats that I acknowledged as I introduced this bill was that I am not omnipotent. That is, I don't know every single circumstance that a law enforcement officer may encounter when he or she is engaging in public service in this instance. And that's the reason why I, in my bill, did not pursue a complete ban of no-knock warrants. There may be a circumstance where, for example, there's a terrorist who is concocting a bomb in a building. And I don't want to conflate issues. I mean, there's some things called dynamic entries and whatnot, but you can imagine potentially a circumstance where a no-knock warrant may very well be appropriate. And if it is, then there are now in our state of Nevada, in state law, not just policy, state law, restrictions on that use of no-knock warrants where you're going to have to prove it up, you're going to have to double check it, and you're going to have to ensure that it's being utilized in the best and safest way possible. The last thing I'll say is this, and if you lie about it, there's now a repercussion in the law. If you lie about the need for a no-knock warrant and you execute on that lie, there's going to be a repercussion. It's written into the law. So with that, I'll attend to the mic.
So as we know, no-knock warrants are highly controversial, and several local progressive organizations have called, as you mentioned, for a complete ban. Leslie Turner, I want you to chime in here. Do you think this bill does enough to address no-knock warrants?
I would say it is a good first step in Nevada specifically, but I think in terms of like community organizations, people who are impacted by police violence and people who are out there on the front lines, who were protesting this summer, I don't know that that was actually one of our demands. We haven't seen necessarily like no-knock situations here in Nevada, but I think as to what the Attorney General was just speaking, like trying to prevent that from ever happening, that makes sense as long as there is an accountability piece, which we did, we talked about, we went back and forth, during the legislative session. I think it's important if we're crafting legislation on police reform that we are talking to people who have been negatively impacted by the police. Because there seems to be this thing where it's like, you're gonna talk to the people who are gonna speak nicely to you. You're gonna talk to the people who agree with you, or maybe will, respectfully disagree with you, but you need to talk to those whose loved ones have been killed by the police. And you need to listen to those demands and bring forth legislations that reflect those demands. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. Senator Dallas Harris brought forth and supported several police reform bills this past year. Senate Bill 212 requires police officers to use de-escalation techniques, and if it can be done safely, to identify themselves as law enforcement before resorting to deadly force. It also took aim at last year's protest response. Senate Bill 212 has passed the Assembly and the Senate, but has not been signed by the governor yet. Senator Harris, can you talk a little bit more about this bill and what areas it addresses? I know that it was rewritten a few times.
I'd be more than happy to. Thank you so much for having me. And you gave a great summation of the bill. We require officers to use de-escalation techniques before using higher levels of force. We created a statewide use of force database that will be publicly available to every Nevadan. We put in some restrictions on the use of restraint chairs, which are often used in correctional facilities. And we have seen people here in Nevada die in those restraint chairs. And so we wanted to make sure we put some strict protections in place. And again, as you mentioned, we put in some protections for protesters, right? Which is so important. We're at a time where in other states, Republican legislatures are putting forward punishments for people who are protesting. And so here, it was really important that we made clear that if you're going to use a kinetic energy projectile, like a rubber bullet, that there must be good cause, that there be immediate danger, that you don't aim for vital areas of a person's body. If you're going to use chemical agents, you must first declare it an unlawful order. Give people a route of egress and time and space to comply with that order. So the bill altogether does quite a bit, and I hope it moves us forward in the right direction in codifying what are really some of the best practices in policing.
And Rick McCann, you originally weren't in favor of this bill as a whole. Can you tell what your tell us what your concern was from a law enforcement perspective?
Yes, thank you. The final bill is the most important part of the bill for most of us up here. But when we go into a bill, it's the brainchild of a variety of different input. And I'm not going to blow any smoke up their skirts, but between this gentleman to my left, Attorney General Ford, certainly Senator Harris, they put an awful lot of time into bringing the stakeholders, as we call them, to the table. We spent a lot of time talking about, okay, this sounds good, but how does it operate operationally with a law enforcement officer? And they listened. What we had problems with early on was what we had problems with on a national scale. And well, I'm sure we'll get to that here shortly, but qualified immunity, things of that nature. Things that we have some concerns about in terms of a wholesale ban. And you know what? These people sat with us and talked to us, because something I've said years ago about law enforcement, don't talk about us, talk to us. And that has been ultimately, I think, the refrain we've heard from a lot of the people in the 81st session. We're going to talk to law enforcement, at least some of us. Some chose not to be part of the discussion, and that's why they're not here today. I'm here today, not because I'm a great person, but because we listened, and they listened to us. So yes, there were some initial areas we had. We spent weeks and weeks and weeks going through the BDR, the bill draft request, before it ultimately hit the stores, so to speak, as a full bill. And we talked about it, we tweaked it. And anybody who knows how to access these bills on the legislative process on the internet, take a look at how these things went. It's a testament to the legislators' hard work. It's a testament to the lobbyists' hard work. It's a testament to people who were neither legislators nor lobbyists, but had someone who may have been hurt or killed in a police action. Those people were listened to. That's important to know. And I think that's something that I think throughout this entire process, that's the one thing I want to get across. There was discussion, there was give and take, and cool heads prevailed. Even though on day one, we may not have agreed. But on day 120, we agreed, and we got good legislation.
What pushback did you receive from the local police unions here?
Well, I represent a lot of police unions, about 1,500 police officers throughout the state of Nevada with my organization. Not every police union, I'm sad to say, saw it as an opportunity for discussion. There were some groups that just took a hell no attitude. We're big, we're mighty, we're going to say no. And we're going to stand in the way of any form of reform because they looked at reform as a bad word. Reform is not a dirty word. Law enforcement, police reform is not a dirty term. It's all how the perspective is worked through and good legislation is come by. I'm committed, our organization is committed to adopting good legislation in the final hour, not taking a position that is unnecessary, that is unreasonable, and just because it gets us points by some particular faction out there that wants to say, hey, yeah, those guys are tough. We're tough too. We stood in there when we had to. But police reform, reimagining police, they're not dirty words. I'm not a defund the police person, but aside from that, there's a lot to be discussed because our country is undergoing an awful lot. Law enforcement has made some mistakes, but I'll be damned if I'm going to allow those mistakes to define all of law enforcement. It just isn't that way. And we don't have these problems for the most part, no knocks and whatnot. We don't have these issues in Nevada, but we want to make sure we don't. There's nothing wrong with that. Being prepared is a good thing.
So Assembly Bill 58 gives the Attorney General's office the ability to subpoena witnesses and documents related to use of force cases. Now, this bill was first mentioned last year during one of our panel discussions about police reform, and it unanimously passed in the Assembly and the Senate, and it has been signed by the governor. Attorney General, how does this bill change the current oversight of use of force cases?
Well, thank you for the question, and let me add that so was no knock warrants mentioned at a year ago today, sitting on this stage. Look, what you've seen coming out of this session is not a one and done. It's an Aaron. I have a frat brother whose name is Lou, and I wish my name was his so that I can say what he says. I'm not new at this. I'm Lou at this. because I've been doing this for a while, being engaged in conversation with community members who are actively seeking redress. I'm born and raised in a neighborhood that experienced police issues from a brutality perspective, from a lack of trust perspective, and from a perspective that needed reform, if not complete overhaul. But again, recognizing that none of us are omnipotent. None of us know everything about anything, let alone everything about everything. I went into this session trying to find opportunities to put forth good policy that could, again, enhance the trust between all communities and law enforcement. Assembly Bill 58 was one of those examples. Frankly, I thought that it was going to be a very tough bill to get across the finish line, and it was tough in the sense that we had stakeholders on all sides, both district attorneys and public defenders, both the police and the ACLU. And the ACLU is representing community groups in the midst of our conversations around things, trying to figure out ways in which to tailor this policy in the best way moving forward. AB 58 is one that gives my office the ability to do what we call pattern and practice investigations. These are investigations into police departments that are alleged to be engaging in unconstitutional or unlawful policing of certain communities, i.e., you could be discriminatorily policing black people, or maybe there's a gender-based issue within a particular department that we have to address. This state did not have that. I did not have that authority until May 25th, the anniversary of George Floyd's death, 2 weeks ago, when the governor signed the bill that passed unanimously as indicated. The federal government has had that authority for a while, and the federal government has utilized that authority except for the last administration. The last administration, General Sessions, said that this is not something the federal government should be doing, it's something that the state government should be doing. So I said, then let's have the state give us that authority. And fortunately, we were able to get that passed. And I think, again, it provides a level of accountability and transparency to the process to ensure that those who are aggrieved by police practices, and we are able to determine that those practices are in fact patterns and practices of unconstitutional or unlawful policing, we can address it via a civil action that requires, at the end of the day, if we were to prevail, changes in attitudes and practices in those police departments.
Leslie, I just want to take a step back to what Rick McCann had said about police reform. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the hell no that is coming from the police unions, some police unions, I should say.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have an opinion on that, but I do believe that we do need to defund the police. And that is a controversial statement, and I can't really understand why, because we've been defunding systems like my entire life. Education has been defunded, mental health has been defunded. So why is it a controversial statement to say, maybe it's the word we're using, maybe we need to say reallocate, a line item in the budget. Maybe that sounds better, but basically, we need to stop spending so much money on policing and prisons and just the carceral system in general, and start actually putting more money in the front end for communities to be able to have what they need to thrive. It's very simple. So I think in terms of reimagining police, we're going to have to start moving around money and investing in people, investing in communities, investing in neighborhoods, investing in, growing food, investing in jobs, investing in all the things that keep people clear of the criminal justice system. And it's, we might say defunding the police. That's a demand that came from movement, that came from impacted people on the ground. So it cannot be disregarded. And maybe you don't like that term, and that's fine. But again, we need to look at the dollars, and we need to look at how we're spending them, and that's nationwide.
Am I on? Very good. Leslie raises some very good points about allocating funds toward things that communities need. And that's, for example, one of the reasons why when I was in the state Senate, we funded what we call the MOST programs, mobile outreach support teams, that are programs that would allow, if police officers receive a 911 call and they know that there's a mental health issue potentially involved, then they will be accompanied by professional mental health personnel on that particular trip and on that particular visit. That's one way of ensuring that we can, instead of policing a situation, address it from a mental health issue if that's an issue, if that's a concern. I'm a former educator. I'm a teacher. I've been in the schools that are underfunded when I taught in inner city Austin, Texas. I'm from an underfunded school in Dallas, Texas, where I was born and raised in Oak Cliff. And so recognizing that the importance of funding education has always been something that's necessary and important. I want to compliment what she's saying in that regard, that's exactly accurate. If we can keep folks from being directed to the criminal justice system in the first place, then we would have less issues in the criminal justice context.
And if I may, now I broke it. If I may, okay, I'll use my outdoor voice. I have to echo also what Leslie said. When I say that I'm not behind defunding the police, I'm not behind that term as it has been used inappropriately in some areas around the country. Defund meaning get rid of. No one in this room may believe that, but there are factions of people who do. We will not support that. You need police. You need law enforcement. However, it doesn't mean that they are exclusive to the needs of the communities, and to the extent that other things can be done to support these projects that need to be done for people, we're all for that. And that's, like you said, sitting down and discussing bottom line budgetary situations. I think our own sheriff here in Clark County, Joe Lombardo, has agreed that that type of thing needs to be done, at least in some respect. So when I say I'm not behind the defund the police, it is at that extreme level I'm talking about.
And I just wanted to add that, like, defunding the police is like a first step towards abolishing the police, which, yes, like, that is what needs to happen. And so abolishing the police is not, that doesn't mean that, you know, next month or even next year that we will be in a situation where we don't need police. Obviously, that cannot happen. So what it is saying, though, is that over time, this is over decades, maybe over my entire life, maybe over your entire life, that the more we invest in communities, the less need we have for the carceral system as a whole. So when we're talking about abolition, it's really important that folks like dig a little deeper and get into these conversations with people on the ground, because that's not what we mean. We don't mean just, you know, shut down Metro right now. Like that doesn't even make any sense. So again, it is about the future. What are we doing for the future of our children? What are we doing for the future of our people, the future of our communities? We should be figuring out how we can stop putting so many people in cages. We should be figuring out how we can stop people from being murdered. We should be figuring out how we do that. And we don't do that by putting more money into the police. We do that by putting more money into the community. And there's plenty of research that supports that.
Thank you. Senate Bill 236 addressed police training, procedure, and potential police bias. And I want to bring Senator Harris into this conversation. So this bill requires law enforcement agencies to establish an early warning system for police officers who display problematic behavior. How exactly would that work?
Well, I imagine it can work in a bunch of different ways, and I drafted the bill in such a way that each police department can develop the early warning system that works for them. The important part here is that we all have bias and we all don't know it. And when it comes to policing, that bias, when it manifests itself, results in disproportionate use of force and disproportionate loss of life. And so in this profession, more so than others, it's important that police departments be on the lookout for officers who may unknowingly be displaying some bias, offer them some curative measures, right? This is not about punishment. Offer them support, additional training, additional resources, whatever may be needed so that that bias can be addressed and lead to ideally better relationships between police and the community.
Thank you.
I just want to compliment my senator. Senator Dallas Harris, she's my senator, because she's unafraid. A lot of people get to the position of being in an elected office and they shy away from difficult and tough issues. That's never been me. It's not my current senator. No one will ever be completely satisfied with what you do on either side of the issue. But tackling the issue, being unabashed and addressing an issue, you are there to represent a constituency, a voice that would not be there if you weren't there voicing it. And so the things that Dallas Harris did in the face of certain unions, for example, who were completely absent from the conversation with her, but entirely in conversations with others, trying to downplay what she was doing, I think it's worth mentioning out loud that Dallas Harris is a hero, and I'm glad she's my senator.
Now,
I appreciate that. I appreciate that, AG. Just, trying to follow in those big old footsteps you left for me.
another bill, AB 111, places additional members on the Peace Officers Standards and Training Board to address implicit bias, cultural competency, and mental health issues. And Rick McCann, this is a bill that you supported, correct?
Among the other ones you've talked about, we ultimately supported, yes. But yes, we supported this on day one. There's nothing wrong with taking a 7 or 9 person post commission and adding a couple of people that have expressed expertise in areas that we've come to know need to be explored. Implicit and explicit bias, cultural competence, mental health related to law enforcement, working with children, the elderly, people of that nature, people in the vulnerable position, as I'll call them. There's nothing wrong with putting a couple of people on the post, the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, that give officers their certification to become law enforcement officers. There's no reason why we should not have some people in there that bring to the table that kind of expertise that has been lacking. What it will do to any particular officer who seeks to be a cop, I don't know. We don't know yet. But what's the problem in having people with those expertise? We should not be afraid of expanding our knowledge base. We should not be afraid of expanding the expertise that goes into finding and certifying the most highly qualified and efficient law enforcement that we can produce in this state.
Moving on to what didn't pass, several other police reform bills were abandoned, some without any public input. Assembly Bill 243 would have created a statewide police reform advisory task force. Assembly Bill 268 would require law enforcement agencies to adopt a written policy on de-escalation techniques and the lawful use of force on a suspect. And Assembly Bill 395 would have abolished the death penalty. So Attorney General Aaron Ford, what does meaningful police reform look like to you?
Well, I think it first off begins with a recognition that no one gets everything they want. Period, point blank. That we have to get in a room and talk about issues that are of import, and that we have to try to find a way forward. Again, I'm not new at this. I wish my name was Lou. I'm Lou at this, right? In 2015, when I introduced it as the minority leader, the concept of getting body cameras on all law enforcement officers, I was met with opposition. And I was in the minority, with really no way of forcing that to be passed. But from the minority, I was able to get it passed by limiting it to state officers in the first instance. And then 2 years later, I expanded it to require, when I was majority leader, to require everybody who comes in common contact with the public to wear body cameras. And I think police reform sometimes has to take steps, incremental steps. We live in a circumstance, an environment where everyone is looking for instant gratification, instant responses, and sometimes that can happen. Generally speaking, it doesn't. And so I view meaningful police reform as an outcome. You've talked about what didn't pass. I'm very confident that some of the things that did pass are going to have some great impact on policing in our state. And maybe we'll talk about those a little later as well.
And Rick McCann, you mentioned before that you opposed any legislation that sought to eliminate or grossly modify qualified immunity. And can you just explain why?
Sure. Everybody has heard the term qualified immunity. A couple times I've been interviewed for news media, and we played a little game. Everybody raised their hand if they know what qualified immunity is, how it's applied, Who makes decisions on them? Does it apply to a civil case, a criminal case? What are the things that can be used for? If you don't know what qualified immunity is, with all due respect, you don't know whether you want it or not. It's become a rallying point, in my humble opinion. Get rid of that, you get rid of the problems. That's not the case. Qualified immunity is a balancing test between holding public officials, law enforcement as well, accountable, and balancing that against the harassment that may come from frivolous lawsuits, and there is data upon that people will decide, well, now that I can basically hold a law enforcement officer financially responsible, and he or she does not have the ability of demonstrating that they shouldn't be in the case, I'm going to get my day. And that's where frivolous lawsuits are born. Not everybody agrees with me, of course. However, I have to go back to the basics that I just said. If you don't know what qualified immunity is, why do you know if you need it or don't? We know how qualified immunity works. We know when it's used. And you know, the people who are ultimately deciding whether qualified immunity attaches to a particular case, it's a judge. Now, am I completely opposed to strengthening the processes by which judges look at qualified immunity motions? I'm not opposed to having that conversation. That's why I said the complete abandonment or elimination of it is my problem. Am I completely opposed to taking a look at it and say, well, maybe the agencies should have some further responsibility financially as opposed to the officers? Well, I don't like that, but we'll talk. Remember, we started this conversation by saying we talk. That's the good part. Discussion is a good thing. It's not a bad word. But we are wholly against the full elimination of it for reasons I've just kind of stated. But we're always willing to discuss things that may make it better. Senator Harris, in one of her bills, ultimately did bring up qualified immunity. But she didn't seek a full abandonment of it, as I recall, Dallas. Correct me if I'm wrong. She sought some changes. Those changes were ultimately not to everyone's satisfaction, and they were removed from the bill. I'm sure it's going to come up again. Qualified immunity is not something that we can just blink our eyes and go away. We're not in Kansas anymore. It's going to come up, and we'll deal with it. And we'll deal with it every time with the idea of how to make law enforcement better and how to make our relations with our communities better. Qualified immunity is just a term right now to many people. I caution against that. But let's take a look at it when we need to and make things better. That's all I'm here for.
Well, qualified immunity is not just a term to me. I know exactly what it is, and I think there needs to be some reform to qualified immunity. I didn't bring a bill to reform qualified immunity. My Senator Dallas Harris did, and she's having that conversation, and I can guarantee that conversation will probably continue at the state level, but it's absolutely happening at the federal level right now. I used to be a law clerk working for a federal judge over 20 years ago at this point, and I remember, and I'm sure Rick would agree with this, you can see some fact patterns that come before the court where you would say, she absolutely should be found liable for this. There was no question that what happened here is wrong, unlawful, and there should be some liability associated with it, but qualified immunity stopped it because there was no exact fact pattern in the law where this has taken place, right? And recognizing that that's a fact, again, lends itself to the requirement that there are beyond conversations with actual things that can be done. Colorado, for example, has amended its qualified immunity statute to provide more liability, as I understand it, more liability for the department itself. Maybe you can help if I'm wrong in that regard, and at the federal level, they're talking about something comparable, looking for more what we call municipal liability or liability for the employer in circumstances of qualified immunity. And again, these conversations are necessary and important because communities that are policed by police officers need to have trust in those officers. And you cannot, it's difficult to have trust when the officers are able to do something so blatantly problematic and there be no consequence for the actions. And speaking truth to that issue shouldn't be considered a black eye or even anti-police for that matter. It should be something that's viewed as honesty and something that is viewed as integrity and something that is viewed as something that we need to be working toward in the first instance. And so I want to say that out loud. And as we talked about qualified immunity, there was a tangent that came to my mind, and we need to mention this out loud because Listen, again, I've used the word omnipotent 3 times, maybe twice. This is my 3rd time. We don't know what officers see on the street every single day. And there's no way you can guess. There's no way you can even imagine what they may be addressing. Just like we couldn't imagine in 2014 that officers Soldo and Beck will be ambushed and killed. Today is the anniversary of their death.
Yes.
And we should absolutely recognize the sacrifice that they have put forth to ensure that communities can be safe. And that's the reason why this conversation has to take place from a real perspective, not a hypothetical one, not one that doesn't take into consideration the truth, both not just from those who are being policed, but also from those who are doing the policing. And that's why I'm so proud of what we were able to do this session with the 2 bills that we passed, and things that Dallas Harris has been able to do, and things that others are able to do, because it's an important conversation to have.
I just wanted to follow up on what General Ford said. The Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, the more recent cases, have in fact start to whittle away, I believe, my term, some of the, hey, it's got to be the exact type of case. Not necessarily. The Supreme Court is starting to recognize that. The Supreme Court, well, some people may disagree, but they're not stupid. I mean, they can figure stuff out. It takes them a while. But they can figure stuff out, and they're starting to figure out that the doctrine of qualified immunity may have some rough edges. I wouldn't disagree with them. Abandonment or complete repeal of it, if you will, no. Because there's other unintended, sometimes intended, consequences to that. But like I said, we're open to conversations, not unlike the Colorado scheme. We're open to conversations on the state level and on the federal level. And if we don't agree, that's okay. But we're here to improve with good legislation. We work with our legislators to improve. And those who choose not to be part of the conversation will be left behind when we come up with good legislation. But I'll be damned if we're just going to blame cops for everything, and I'll be damned if we're going to blame the community for everything. We all have a vested interest in this discussion.
Can I just add that for community, like for folks who are impacted by police violence in our communities, and we see our communities over-policed all the time, that comes with trauma. So sometimes it's hard for someone whose loved one has been killed by the police to come into a conversation with police officers, or to come onto a stage and sit next to like someone representing the police department. So I just want to say that. And also in terms of qualified immunity, the part that's kind of just not making sense to my brain is a judge can determine if a lawsuit is frivolous or not, correct? Okay, that's
Right.
it. So you don't have qualified immunity. You go in front of a judge and a judge will decide. Simple.
Thank you. Senator Harris, I had mentioned before about the death penalty. Lawmakers killed a proposed ban on the death penalty. Can you tell us what happened there?
Sure. So first, I just want to start off by saying that Mr. McCann is correct. Qualified immunity will be back. The discussion will continue, and I very much put all of the law enforcement stakeholders on notice that the conversation is by no means over. A little bit of good news: Assembly Bill 268, although did not pass the Senate on its own, every provision of that bill was placed into Senate Bill 212. And so Assembly Bill 268, known as Micaiah's Law, will in fact be law once the governor signs Senate Bill 212. As to your question about the death penalty, you know, it's a big deal. It's a big change. One thing I've learned from my short time in Nevada politics is that nothing happens quickly. We'll talk about the decriminalization of traffic tickets, I'm sure, in a minute here, but that passed after its 5th session. And so the discussion behind a repeal or a partial repeal didn't quite get there in the 120 days that we had, and I know that those conversations will continue as well. That issue will be brought back, and hopefully we'll be able to get it over the finish line soon here.
And as the senator mentioned, beyond the police-specific legislation, several proposals to reform other parts of the criminal justice system were pushed, including changing most minor traffic and jaywalking tickets from criminal misdemeanors to civil infractions. So that was Assembly Bill 116. It passed in the Assembly and the Senate. It was also signed by the governor today. Why was this such an important issue to tackle during the legislative session? And Senator Harris had mentioned it was its fifth go-around. And Leslie Turner, I know your team worked tirelessly along with several other organizations, maybe someone here, to get this done.
Yeah. So why is it important? Is that the question? Because number one, people should not be incarcerated for inability to pay. That is the definition of the criminalization of poverty. And when we look at the data, the numbers, it shows that I think it was over 80% of the people who were in active warrant for failure to pay were in warrant because of, they were driving without valid registration. They didn't have a valid driver's license. These were not like moving violations or dangerous drivers or DUI situations. These were literally people who just could not pay. And I think the vast majority of people, from an anecdotal and a data perspective, which there's so much data out there, y'all. Like literally, we were only one of 13 states still doing this. So we can look to the other states and we can look at their data to see that people actually do want to pay their traffic tickets. They just need to not have the threat of a cage hanging over their head in order to get it done. So this is something that I'm personally impacted by. When my son was 4 months old, I was arrested for unpaid traffic tickets. I was coming out of maternity leave, but I didn't have I didn't actually have maternity leave. I was just off from work because I just had a baby. And I had just got a job. I was I knew that my tickets were in warrant, but I'm like, okay, let me just get this first paycheck and then I'll get back on a payment plan. And I never got to do that because I was pulled over and I was arrested and I was taken away from my 4-month-old baby who I was breastfeeding, all over traffic tickets. And my traffic tickets were literally for unregistered, like my car wasn't registered. Why? Because I didn't have the money. So it's just a vicious cycle that people get caught up in. And I think it's something that it was definitely about time for it to happen. So I'm glad that it finally passed. I also believe that, this is the bare minimum. Yeah. This is this is something that should not be happening, period. So it's yes, I'm glad that we were able to pass this bill. I'm glad that it was signed into law today. And much love and adoration for everyone who worked on this over the past 10 years. But it shouldn't have taken 10 years to pass this. And that's just simple. So, and I think from most law enforcement folks that I've talked to, they agree. They actually don't want to be taking people to jail for traffic offenses. So I think it was just something that, should have been done a long time ago.
Oh my, I talked about Senator Harris having the gumption to fight for what she believes in, irrespective of the pushback she's going to get. You got to give credit to Leslie Turner and her group for doing the exact same thing. Community organizations that speak out on issues like this, time after time after time, you got to give credit to them, because I saw her in the building today for that signing, and I was so glad you were there. Let me tell you something. I just turned 49 years old 2 weeks ago. 30 years ago, a 19-year-old Aaron Ford got arrested for two unpaid traffic tickets that went to warrant and a failure to appear from going to court. A broke college student didn't have the money to pay those things. These things can have virtually perpetual ramifications on someone's well-being. How do I know? Because 25 years later, Leslie, my unpaid traffic tickets were put on the front page of the Review Journal as Aaron Ford been arrested 4 times. 2 of those are for unpaid traffic tickets. You understand what I'm saying? And they were used in a way to make Aaron Ford out to be this thug who did not have the authority or the right to be running for the top law enforcement officer in the state, because he had 2 arrests for unpaid traffic tickets. There were 2 others, one for being drunk on campus, who ain't ever drunk on campus, by the way, and there was one that was a payment dispute. But in any event, the truth of the matter is, what you've done, which I've been able to accomplish, which took 5 times to get done, is worth more than just saying it should have happened 10 years ago. You got it done. And that's good stuff. And I'm going to give you credit for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Before we open the floor up to questions, I just want to touch a little bit upon national police reform. So a few weeks ago, Washington State enacted 12 new laws aimed at reducing the use of deadly force. And I'll just kind of go through what it looks like. So the focus of the bills range from tactics officers use in the field to how deadly force incidents are investigated to the circumstances under which officers can be decertified. So they'll establish a statewide use of force database and ensure that police agencies notify prosecutors about officers with credibility issues. And the governor there also signed a bill that instructs the state auditor to review all completed deadly force investigations to ensure that rules and procedures were followed. So for advocates of police reform, what Washington did legislatively seems more far-reaching than what the Nevada legislator accomplished. So I want to open this up to all of you, and you all can answer on your own. What should the 2023 Nevada legislator look to tackle in the near future?
I can kick it off. As far as police reform, right?
Yes.
I think investing in alternatives to policing really needs to be at the forefront, and looking at public safety, looking at what communities actually need to keep ourselves safe, and having that be defined by the community, and investing in that, whether it's programs, whether it's community gardens, whether it's co-ops, whether it's access to mental health, whatever it is, it needs to be defined by those who are experts, because we live this every day, and then investing in that. I think that that's really important, is just investing in the alternatives to the carceral state, period.
Thank you. Rick?
Well, I guess I could take the position of some of our colleagues that I don't really like and say, screw it, nothing should change. But that's not fair. There's going to be a reexamination every time we turn around on police reform. And again, that's not a bad word. What I don't want to do is make good, hardworking cops into criminals overnight for doing the same job. That is a good job. But we do need to identify problems when they exist. There's a term that you legislators use. Mr. McCann, are you advocating, is this a solution looking for a problem? Or is it a problem seeking a solution? Let's have the problem identified, and there are many. Let's seek a solution, and there are many. Let's conform our thoughts, as we have done in this session, in future sessions, and come up with a way to, if we need to, change the paradigm in some areas that may need it for policing in our state and across the country. Again, don't make a cop into a criminal overnight for doing a good job. But if there's training that needs to be done, let's find the funding to train people. Let's get them done. Cops are animals of training. That's what they do. They train constantly. So train them. Train them differently if necessary, but train them. But don't hold them responsible when they go home on Friday night to a different standard come Monday morning. That's not fair. It wouldn't be fair to you and what you do. It's not fair to cops. So fairness is important, but identify a problem, identify a solution, work toward that solution, train these officers, and shift that paradigm that they have been working under for decades. It's not a bad thing, but let's do it right. That's all I'm asking.
Thank you. Order, yep.
Okay, I was going to defer to my senator. I'd love to hear what she has to say, maybe follow up.
Sure. Senator Harris?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Attorney General. I think Leslie hit the nail on the head. One thing I will be focusing on over the interim is trying to further reduce police interactions. I think that is the goal that we need to be reaching and searching for every time we think about this issue. I often say we have the fire department respond to fires. We have EMTs responding to medical services. You call up your gas company if you have a gas leak. Almost every other crisis we expect police to respond to. And that's not fair for the community, and frankly, it's not fair for the officers because, you know, as Mr. McCann was stating, they aren't trained for that, right? They're trained for certain scenarios. They aren't trained to deal with every crisis, and I think we really do have to take a serious look at how we respond to the different needs of the community. I'm also a big fan of the phrase that a pound of prevention is worth an ounce of cure. And so we do need to continue to look at how do we put our resources on the front end instead of investing so heavily on the back end by incarcerating folks or by heavily arming, our police departments. And those are tough issues that we're going to have lots of conversations about. And so I'll be looking forward to those.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to everything that's been said here because what they've said is exactly right. I've given kudos to Leslie, kudos to my senator. I need to give kudos to the man next to me as well, right? Because he's talking about accountability, he's talking about training. And from my perspective, what I want to do is continue what we've already started. Now, we need to ensure that we can implement what we just passed. And in my office, we're going to be looking to ensure that we can actually implement, we know we can, but we want to set up our process of implementing pattern and practice investigations. That's accountability. And that's the vantage point I'm coming from. You see, that first bill that I put out, the first draft of that bill, also had my office receiving some level of concurrent authority in officer-involved use of force that resulted in death or substantial bodily harm. I looked internally and determined that we could not do that. We didn't have the expertise, and so we removed that from the bill. But as that Senator Harris has, so have I given a forewarning to others that we're bringing that back. We're trying to get our training right now. It's an accountability issue. It's trying to ensure that those who are trained, Rick, actually follow their training.
Sure.
And if they don't, then there has to be a consequence for doing that. And again, without the consequence, not only the consequence, but transparency of the consequence being implemented, it's very difficult to augment trust, to restore trust, and to create it in communities that it hadn't existed in the first place.
It sounds trite, and I'm not the author of it, but I'm going to say it. Nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. And that is something to take home. Good cops don't mind changes that make them better. And if it happens to snare a couple of those bad ones out there, and there may be some, then they'll get what's coming to them. I firmly am convinced that we do have a pretty good investigative and justice system out there. It could be better. But I do believe that the Derek Chauvins of the world, we may see more of that. I'm not looking forward to it, but if a cop does something wrong, the cop should be punished, disciplined. My job is to represent officers. That's what I do every day. I go to officer-involved shootings in the middle of the night, and I stand and look at bodies. I'm there with my officer to make sure their rights are protected, because guess what? They have rights too. We have a thing called a Peace Officer Bill of Rights in the state of Nevada, which sometimes is under attack all by itself, and will be again. But you have to understand that nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. So from our perspective, bring it. We'll deal with legislation that improves what officers do and holds them accountable. Nothing wrong with that. It's just unfortunate some of my brethren do not believe that.
That's why I'm so glad to see that the legislature listened to the community when they asked for the duty to intervene to be put in the statute. I mean, this idea of a cop watching another cop batter somebody unconstitutionally and that cop doing nothing about it, that's what helps to engender distrust in the community. But now you have a duty to intervene where the good cop who doesn't like a bad cop needs to be intervening. And now we have it in law. And so, I mean, again, that's a positive step forward on improving their relationships.
Leslie, we'll end with you.
I just wanted to add that I think that we're at a point where we're kind of rejecting the whole bad apple theory, because historically we haven't seen good cops hold bad cops accountable. We just haven't seen it. So it's again, what we see in our communities every single day is our reality. So maybe it's that perception is reality. Maybe it is that's just not what's happening. And I think the problem with policing is it's a systemic problem that's rooted in its inception, which, you know, A.G. Ford, we talk about this a lot, and I appreciate your perspective on the historical kind of point, but it's not a bad apple problem at all. And so I completely reject that theory. And I think we need to look at systemic change, we need to look at an overhaul, and we need to look at creating new systems, new realities for ourselves that keep us safe in our communities outside of the police, period.
Thank you. So we have a mic set up over here. If anyone has any questions, I'll just ask that you use the mic over here because this is being live streamed, so we'll need the audio. So with that being said, does anyone have any questions for any of the panelists up here about tonight's discussion?
Oh, come on.
Yep, can you just walk up here, please? Thank you.
Lamar Jones. I grew up here in this community and pretty much off of Martin Luther King and Cary. So I've seen a lot of the things go on. But there's a couple of things I wanted you to touch on, Mr. Rick, is number one is the qualified immunity. Everybody spoke about what qualified immunity. You asked the question, do we know, but there's no definition given to that. Second thing is, in some of the bills and that Sister Dallas, I'd like to see when the bills come up, when they come up in 2023, I would like to see that it has something with mandatory cameras stay on at all times unless you're going to break and you call in and actually can have an opportunity to turn it off. I don't think that, like, say, all cops are bad cops. I think the culture and the policy was what makes the things bad. And that's where the fear and everything comes in. So I just had a statement plus the comment on for you to answer.
You wish for me to comment on qualified immunity again?
He's
To
asking.
give a definition on qualified immunity.
Okay. Well, let's put it in perspective in terms of how practically it works. If I am a police officer and I am sued, oftentimes I'm sued with my agency as well. Say I work for Metro or Henderson or North Las Vegas or wherever. And I am sued in a civil action because of a violation of someone's constitutional rights, the allegation. At some point in time, in order to defend myself, I have what is called an affirmative defense. It's an opportunity for me to be able to file a motion. We sometimes call it a motion for summary judgment, but it's a motion that is filed before the court, not before a jury or anything. It's early in the case to say, I shouldn't be in this case, Judge, because I should be given qualified, not absolute, but qualified immunity. I have to appeal to the judge and have the judge believe that what I did essentially was not a violation of a fundamental interest that we all know about. Something that we all know, a reasonable officer would know, don't do that. The problem is, as Attorney General Ford pointed out, there has been an attitude by a lot of judges, well, if what McCann did, it can't be paralleled to another case that we know of that has the same facts, the same circumstances, well, then apparently he must have done it okay. We can't show that he did something in violation of a fundamental interest that is standard, that we all know about. So therefore, I guess he's okay, he should leave. He should get out of this case. And the judge will dismiss me from that case. So the case does not proceed with me. So it's an early stage process by way of a motion filed by my lawyers that will be filing that motion to have me dismissed because I am immune from suit based upon the idea that I did things that the law recognizes in general are allowed to be done. And good defense lawyers are good at being able to show that what I did is essentially an accepted practice somewhere, someplace, sometime. And that may have certain problems to it, I will admit. Good lawyers are not cheap, but if you get the right ones who know that process, they will be able to fashion their motions accordingly, and many judges have accepted that as the reasoning for allowing people like me, or law enforcement officers, to be dismissed from the case. If the judge does not believe that I have done something that is fundamentally accepted or approved, if you will, an established right, that the court has established as a right, and that I didn't violate that established right, well, if they feel that I did violate that established right, I'm staying in the case. So not every motion for dismissal or summary judgment based upon qualified immunity is granted, but a vast number of them are.
Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Where he said the Supreme Court starting to back off of qualified immunity a little bit. Here's what happens. I think it was a Texas case. A guy was in jail full of feces. Okay? He was in a cell full of feces for an extended period of time. You know this case?
I do.
He was in a cell full of feces, and he said that this violates my constitutional rights. I shouldn't be required to be in a cell full of feces like this. And he sued, and the court said, well, there's nothing that says you can't be. And so therefore, we're gonna let the officer off the hook. The Supreme Court said, now come on. You don't have to find a case out there that says you can't put somebody in a cell full of feces in order for us to be able to determine that you have violated their constitutional rights. So that's the kind of argument that goes back and forth in this, and I'm paraphrasing obviously and summarizing a little bit, but that's the kind of argument that goes back and forth on qualified immunity. And that's why they're saying it has to be changed. Because the dude got out of the case by saying, ain't no law that said I can't put him in some feces. Say what? So.
And as I indicated before, maybe there needs to be a more exhaustive discussion about, all right, judges, district court judges, or whatever the judge may be in that particular jurisdiction. These are the types of things you need to look at more routinely. And that's what the Supreme Court is attempting to do with some of its more recent decisions. Again, it's a slow process. Justice is, in fact, slow. We can wait for that to whittle away over the next decades, but that's not good enough. We may have to address these things. But we may have to address them in ways that say, judges, since you're the ultimate arbiters of these decisions, this is what you need to focus more on. And that's a conversation I think that everybody should have.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jagada Chambers. I'm curious, there was actually some progress made as to criminalization of youth during the legislative session with ending the practice of sending youth to adult court and also decriminalizing juveniles' possession of cannabis. I'm curious what the panel feels about policing as it deals with youth. I know Clark County School District is devoting over $20 million of its budget to school district police. Where does, Mr. Rick, I want to say, where does your team, do you represent the school district policing? And is that something that we feel that we could go away from? I'm curious to know what the panel might think. Thank you.
Well, I don't represent the Clark County School District. I used to in years past. I do not now. So I won't obviously offer any thoughts relative to them. But this is part of not just police reform. This is part of criminal justice reform. And every session, whether it be the last session in the special session during the past summer or this session here, criminal justice reform is always one of the major things that every governor wants to have ultimately seen. And it's for good reason. We're dealing with sentencing laws. We're dealing with issues relative to children, holding them accountable for adult responses, things of that nature. That's all part of the criminal justice process. From my standpoint, since I'm here representing labor, the law enforcement labor people, you're not going to get a quarrel from me if you put a bill in front of us that does good things for people who need it. Just don't make my cops responsible for the Middle East crisis. Don't make my cops responsible for the gas prices. And I'm being a little facetious, and I don't mean to do that. It's a very serious process. But some people just want to basically hold law enforcement responsible for everything. I'm not saying anybody in this room, and certainly not anybody on this panel. But under the circumstances, it does happen. So I guess the short answer from my standpoint is put a bill in front of us, and you're probably going to find the same kind of commitment to excellence, if you will. Sound like I'm with the Las Vegas Raiders. Commitment to excellence that you saw this session. We'll sit, we'll talk, we may disagree, but we'll come up with some good legislation.
Senator Harris, is this an area that you've looked at all?
It is. And I want to add to the discussion that Assemblyman Flores also had a bill that changed the way Miranda rights are read to juveniles, and that's a huge step forward. As to the school policing issue, there was a time where we did not have school police, and I very much believe that that's where we should go back to. And so that's another huge issue that will take a lot of time and a lot of discussion, but it's worthy of considering.
I have been working in the mental health field for the past 10 years, and a problem that we see with the mental health community is that people who are going through breakdowns or are having mental health issues, they want to get treatment, they want to get help, but you can't get help or be, hospitalized unless you're a danger to yourself or someone else. So we see a lot of people who could have, prevented a situation or, prevented a crime from occurring if they would have received some type of treatment or some type of inpatient services. So the requirements for you to get any type of inpatient services for mental health, you have to be, a danger to yourself or others. But my thing is that the jailhouses, they're majority filled with people that have mental health issues. If you look at the jailhouses, it's at least a third of the jailhouse, they're mental health issues. So it kind of goes back to reallocating funds. It's like we have the funds to, put people in jail, but we don't have the funds to, put people in, inpatient treatment. For these, the things that they're suffering from. And we know that they're a danger to themselves. And that with the legal 2000, even if we know that they're a danger to themselves and we know that they're going to go out and commit a crime, they only could be held up to 72 hours. So, it just comes like this is not necessarily a policing issue. It's more like Leslie was saying, a systematical issue, which, when they mention defund the police, these are things that we are looking at. We want people who have mental health problems, who want to get help and get treatment and get sober, have a place for them to go instead of the jailhouses. So that's it.
Thank you. Does anyone here want to comment on what was said?
Amen.
Yeah.
If I may, I just want to point out a couple of things that I think are relevant to what you were saying. I got to shout out my colleague, our Assistant Majority Leader, Julia Ratty. She brought a couple of bills addressing this very issue, one of which is to help us set up our 988 system, which is a new federal hotline that people can call when folks are having mental health crises, as well as establish what are called crisis intervention centers. For the very types of folks that you are talking about who may be having a mental health crisis and need some assistance. I think that those two together, along with crisis mobilization teams that will be stood up, will also limit police interaction for people who are simply having a mental health crisis and need a little bit of help.
Thank you.
Can I just add
Yes.
to what the senator just said? I think all those things are wonderful. And if we can detach this, over time, all of these things are over time. If we can completely detach it from the carceral system, detach it from law enforcement, let it be its own body of support for the community where it's not connected to the criminal justice system at all.
Yeah.
So I would just add that.
If I may say, the practical but sad part is when you call 911, who are you going to get? Not Ghostbusters. You're going to get a cop. And they may or may not be fully trained. That's why these bills that deal with training, these bills that deal with mental health, putting additional people on the post commission that we talked about with 111, AB 111. These are things that are seeking to make that a better situation. And I'm glad Senator Harris brought up Senator Ratty's bills that deal with trying to look into, unfortunately, it may not be fast enough, but the future of being able to have people say, listen, I don't need a cop to enforce the law. I need somebody to come and deal with my brother who's not with us right now, mentally. Cops don't want to go to those things either if they don't have to, but they're the ones that are called.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Javon. I don't have the expertise in this area at all, which is the reason why it's so great that the legislature has 63 people in there, because several of them have their own areas of expertise. Senator Ratty has been at the forefront of mental health issues for a long time. So I'm glad to see that she was able to get this bill passed to help perpetuate some change in that area.
Hello, everyone. My name is Makaja Daniels, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter chapter at UNLV, and I'm also studying to get my master's in public health. So my question is really rooted in the fact that the National Violence Death Reporting Surveillance System shows that there are 7 types of police murder Black people are overrepresented in being murdered for absolutely no crime. And also, over time, we've seen that Black death has been desensitized. And so my question really lies in the fact that it's twofold. One is, where is the police labor union? Where is the accountability to address racism in policing? And the second is, how do body cameras address racism when the witnessing Black death has become so desensitized? How did they help Jorge Gomez? How did they help Tashi Brown Farmer? How did they help Byron Williams, who had the life choked out of them and taken from them? So that's my question.
You asked about how the police unions feel about what specifically. Part of it kind of clicked out of my head here.
Yeah, so you had said that in order to have these conversations, first address the problem. So an obvious problem is racism. Mm-hmm. Over the years, it's not new. So where is the accountability within the organization that you are representing to address that issue?
Good question. A lot of people think that because the police unions are out there representing law enforcement, that they somehow have the first bite at the apple, so to speak, at changing some of the performance issues of law enforcement. Certainly that comes down to the agencies. Law enforcement unions do not discipline their members for conduct, unless it's some other type of conduct relative to the union. So the first thing I think we got to do is look at the agencies and hold them responsible. That's the accountability of some of these bills. Some of these bills are trying to seek accountability from the agencies, financially or otherwise. I'm not saying go beat up on the agencies, because we have good relationships with many of them, and they're good people. But remember, these law enforcement officers work for a particular agency, which should have policies and procedures in place to guard against these types of things. And if they are violated, well, guess what that does for me as a union guy? I get an officer who calls me and says, "Hey, Rick, I got to go to internal affairs next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Come with me." What's it about? Well, I've been alleged to have been this, or discourteous, or I violated rights, or I did an unlawful search and seizure, or whatever the particulars, or maybe it's a use of force, whatever the situation might be. And I'm protecting their rights. Remember, they have rights too. And we're looking at the process. But who's going to discipline them, to and including discharge, in the event it's that serious? It's going to be the agency that's going to do that. I hate to push it to them, but they're the people who pay these officers. They're the people who train these officers. They're the people who promulgate policy and procedure for these officers. And these fine people in the legislature force them to do so. I mean, you just heard some bills, this particular discussion, that are forcing agencies to come up with policies. Senator Harris has been at the forefront of getting people to create policies, early warning systems, things like that. That's important to keep in mind. There's not an attempt to try to ignore that there may be issues brewing. There's an attempt to try to figure it out ahead of time before it becomes a problem.
I think her next question would be, how can people expect these agencies to investigate their own agency?
Well, I'm glad that she asked that question. First off, let me say this. I don't know where she went, but you keep talking. You keep talking. If we're becoming desensitized to Black lives being taken, then don't let us. And by the way, I'm not desensitized to it, and I'm gonna speak up on it every single time I get an opportunity to do it. I'm a Black man, married to a Black woman, raising 3 Black sons and a nephew. I've said that so many times before, and I'm gonna speak to that issue. I will not allow that to happen as long as I have the ability to speak. Even when people say to me, "Why is everything about race to you?" Right? So there's a lot of pushback in that regard, but you continue to stand up and you speak on those issues because they're important. Now, one of the things that I want to say, though, is that this problem is dynamic. There's not one solution to answer the questions you just asked. Part of it is what he's just said. The agencies have to be responsible. But, so the police unions have to find some way of policing themselves, right? But we just passed AB 58, and I'm putting some of the onus on my own agency to look exactly what you've just said. If it's, in fact, an agency unconstitutionally or unlawfully policing a particular community. And if we find that they are, then there's a civil remedy that we now have in the law that allows me to go to court and to have an injunction against that particular behavior. You either stop it, or you change it, or you do something different, or you do something else, right? And so, there are a lot of different solutions to this problem, and this is a horrible analogy in the context of police conversations. We live in a silver state, but there's no silver bullet when it comes to answering a lot of these questions. We have to keep that in mind as well.
Can you touch just very briefly on her second question about body cameras and, instances like we've seen with Tashi Farmer a few years ago?
Never have I seen a bill that begins in its first draft that ends in the same way it started. Also, have I very rarely seen a bill that was perfect in its first passage. And body cameras is no different in that regard. I was a sponsor of body cameras in 2015. I was a sponsor of body cameras in 2017. And there needs to be some changes to the body camera legislation that requires certain new concepts to be addressed. And I think that our legislators will have to consider how best to address those issues to the extent that I want to do that next session. I'm looking at my people over here because we might have a new BDR coming our way. But those are very real questions. And again, the problems are dynamic. We can't expect one solution to fix all of them. But that issue in particular is something that I think we absolutely have to address on a going forward basis.
Leslie?
And I would just add that, like, the killing of Black people is a ritual in this country, like in America. So, again, it's gonna take more than, oh, now we get to see it live on a body cam. It's gonna take more than that. So that is why we have to start listening to communities when we're saying, no, we just want the police completely out of our community over time and figuring out what that looks like. So I think, again, like you can, and this is historical, you can go back in time, you can look at lynching, you can look at the tactics that were used during colonization, you can look at how enslaved people were, boiled alive. It's a ritual, literally, in this country to sacrifice Black people. So again, it's gonna take more than just, okay, now we see it, so there's gonna be forced accountability. No, we're still gonna have to be fighting for accountability on the one hand, and then on the other end, literally building our own systems of keeping ourselves safe in our own community, and we need funding for that.
We'll just take these last three questions here.
Hello, my name is Doug Nully. I'm a retired California attorney, and in the interest of full disclosure, both of my parents were law enforcement officers. My father was a career law enforcement officer. I have friends in law enforcement. I have some who have retired already. And with that said, there has been a lot mentioned this evening about police reform, but yet hardly a word has been mentioned about public reform. And by that, I'm talking about certain elements of the public who seem to feel that they can do whatever they want to do regardless of a police officer's commands in a situation. And in that regard, I'm concerned because, how many times does a police officer have to say, put the weapon down, put the weapon down? I mean, in body cam footage that I reviewed numerous times, the most common thread that I've seen is that the incident, the use of force incident involved, has started with some type of resistance or use of force on behalf of the defendant involved. And many times that situation escalates to a deadly use of force situation. And I hate seeing that. But again, my question is, where is the public's responsibility in all of this? I mean, isn't it time that we start looking at our own attitudes toward the police and looking at our own approaches when we get stopped? I mean, the vast majority of police contacts with civilians do not involve use of force at all. I could give you an example of one. I mean, on a dark November night, I was going down Cheyenne in Las Vegas, and I blew a tire because I hit one of those raised, what do you call it, islands in the center of the road. I mean, it was a stupid thing for me to do. I mean, it was just a moment of inattention. And fortunately, a couple of Metro officers rolled up and assisted me not only by blocking oncoming traffic with their vehicle, but also getting me to the side of the road and changing my tire. They didn't have to do that for me, and I appreciated that. And so much so that I wrote a letter to the sheriff thanking those two officers and requesting that they be commended for that. You know, you don't hear about incidents like that. You really don't.
So your question is about resisting arrest.
Exactly.
Would anyone like to comment on that?
I got plenty of responses, but I want to tender the mic to some of my colleagues first.
I'll pass it to you.
Senator Harris?
I'll try and keep my remarks brief. I don't believe that there is any amount of insubordination that warrants death. Should people listen to police officers? Yes. And comply with commands? Yes. But short of threatening the officer's life or being a danger to others or the public, your life should remain intact. That's a firm stance that I have to kind of hold strong on there. And I will say, you know, we've actually talked a lot about investing in communities, right? People don't steal as much if they aren't as hungry. So we're talking about trying to give people the tools they need to be successful citizens. I very much believe that is a solution to the problem. I don't believe that there's any amount of insubordination that should lead to death. I also think that the numbers have shown some people are given more chances to comply than others. And when that is not equitable, it results in literally some citizens dying at a higher rate than others. And that should outrage us all.
And anyone else here? Sure.
Senator Harris, what I'm referring to are situations where people resist police officers, okay? And I agree with you with regard to the use of deadly force in that situation. You know, unless we're talking about an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or to someone else, then deadly force obviously should not be used in that situation. But I think you can see how some of these situations escalate quickly to deadly force mode by continued resistance and of course, if others join in and interfere with the officer or officers on the scene, you know, that creates a problem at all. But as far as mere, you know, insubordination, as you put it, I agree with you there. I mean, there's no question in my mind that doesn't justify the use of deadly force, and I have yet to hear of a case where that has actually occurred. But
I'd invite you, sir, to look at the case of Orlando Castile, a young man who was complying with every police order, tried his best to alert the officer that he had a gun. That resulted in his death. So there are plenty of examples where.
Okay, and where did that case? Was it here?
Minnesota.
It was in Minnesota, yes, where compliance is not necessarily the only issue. I believe that sometimes we live in different worlds, right? And my perspective has always been taught to respect police, but that my life still may be in danger. And so it's not always for some of us walking around where we are only in danger if we are resisting or failing to comply. And I think as a society, as a legislator, I need to address those issues. We already have punishments for people who assault officers, who resist arrest. There's a law called resisting arrest. You can be arrested for it. I mean, there's already plenty of protections in place or consequences against those actors. The question that becomes before us, I think the issue we often have is, are there enough consequences for police when those uses of force are unwarranted?
Thank you.
Laws that protect people who are killed by police officers too, you know. They're called civil rights laws, you know, and people have the option, whenever their civil rights are violated in any way, of going in, filing a lawsuit. They can also, if the circumstances warranted, the individual can be prosecuted under federal law.
Well, I know that you're getting ready to move to the next question, and I appreciate it. I'd love to hear a question, but I just want to highlight the fact that we just talked about qualified immunity in the civil context, where that absolutely is less the case than other opportunities. And with all due respect, I think the experience of others in this room differs from yours relative to getting a tire changed and assistance from the cops. You know, that's why she's my senator. She speaks up. She's speaking to a community, speaking on real issues that communities are encountering and attempting to address that in a way that is progressive and positive. So thank you for your work in that regard. I'm looking forward to the next question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, okay, my name's LJ. Sorry, this is a little tall for me. Before I came up here, to be quite frank, I was really nervous, not because I haven't spoke to you guys before, because I spoke to many people on this panel before, but because I always get nervous because I'm an impacted person. My brother Thomas McHenry was killed by LVMPD in 2015. Sir, to you, my brother was having a mental health breakdown, crying and running, saying, stop, don't do that. He was shot when officers came upon 1 minute of arrival. So I'm sorry that your experience was lovely, but many of us are not. I am now frustrated by your response and your blatant disrespect to those impacted by police terrorism. For what it is, I'm gonna continue with what I wrote. Sorry, I had to get that off because it's so disrespectful as an impacted person for someone to stand here in privilege of life and disrespect those who have died doing nothing, begging for their lives. Continue on.
Okay.
The first time, I didn't come up here for questions, sorry, I came up here to give a statement. The first time police reform began was on a federal level in 1920. We are in 2021, and the federal government thinks the solution to reforming the police is to restrict their funding if police organizations don't adhere to policies that barely keep the community safe. That statement alone tells us how far gone the system of policing is. The federal government would rather withhold money from these organizations versus stepping in and creating immediate change to protect its country from this organization that is killing people daily. They would rather stop the funding and restrict it, not completely stop, restrict it. This is also why we need now more than ever to head towards steps of abolishment, like Ms. Turner said. It's not gonna happen overnight, but we need to invest into the community so that it can be abolished. In 1920 is when we started this conversation. It's 101 years later. This conversation should not continue going on now. It is not keeping us safe. You know, in this legislative session, LVMPD representatives refused to work with some local organizations, mine included more than a hashtag LV. You guys refused, the representatives refused, and were against many bills that were in favor of more training, the Jorge Gomez bill that required officers to have more training when coming in contact with those who are open carrying. Our rights as US citizens, we are asking you, when we're open carrying, please have more training when dealing with us so me as a black woman won't get killed. And the representatives got on that call and refused. This is all public records. They refuse more training, they refuse community resources and preventative measures. So when people come up here representing LVMPD and to the public, they think that you guys haven't paid attention to this legislative session, right? They think they can cover it up. We want more training, we want community resources. Please review this last legislative session and see what they really said. See what the representatives said and see how they are not keeping us safe. And that's what I wanted to say.
Okay. Thank you. We'll just take one. All right. Thank you. We have run out of time, and I know these conversations are difficult, and I know they're tough, and I do appreciate those of you who came out today and those of you joining us online for trying to have a productive dialogue. And I'm hopeful, and I want to thank all of you again for coming, and we definitely appreciate you, and have a good night. And thank you to our panelists as well.
Thank you.